Okay, good afternoon guys. So I'm going to go through the audit now with you. So if you haven't done it, then don't continue to watch this, because the point is that you're not just listening to what I tell you and then write them down. Same as any of the other audits that you've done. So go through it first, ticking yes whether you think you know it, no if it's not, and then go through almost a little bit like a test, doing all your yeses first. Add them all up, work it out as a percentage, it'll give you a perceived percentage. And then have it to hand now as I go through these answers, and then you can work out your actual percentage. Okay, so here goes. First one then is attachment. Important thing that you put is that it's a two-way process. Okay, you can't be attached to a inanimate object. Okay, like a blanket or a teddy or something like that. So an attachment is a two-way process between two things. The next one is caregiver-infant interactions, and that's anything that allows for an interaction between those two parties. Remember, the key to an attachment is interaction. So anything that allows for an interaction or strengthens an interaction is going to strengthen an attachment. Okay, so things like imitation, caregiver ease, that kind of stuff. Imitation is the next one. That's simply the idea of mimicking, so copying the behaviour of a caregiver. Melts off and more investigated imitation. Melts off and more is the one with the dummy in the infant's mouth, and then you see whether or not they will copy these behaviours. So one was a hand signal, open mouth, lip protrusion, and so on. And they found that kids as young as 2 weeks old, even in some instances, neonates were imitating. So it shows that it is a feature of human-infant caregiver attachments. Reciprocity. So that is an interaction that results in mutual behaviour. And the key thing about reciprocity is that you can elicit a response from each individual. So the caregiver can make the baby do something, like laugh, but equally so the baby can make the caregiver do something. So if the baby laughs, it makes the adult laugh. So reciprocity is that reciprocal idea, both of them are doing it. Interactional synchrony is a phenomenon that has been investigated using something called microanalysis. So it's where if you film interactions between a caregiver and an infant, and you slow it down, you notice little things such as almost like a dance and like moving your heads, and there's like a rhythmic thing that occurs. So it's a phenomenon that is seen between attached infants and adults. You don't see it with adults interacting with a child if there isn't an attachment, and that's obviously what makes it something to do with attachment. Next one is proximity seeking. And proximity seeking is something that is said to be innate or instinctual, where you want to maintain a proximity, where you want to be around other people as opposed to being on your own. And the next one on there is a precocial species, and they kind of go hand in hand. A precocial species is a species that's immediately mobile at birth or very shortly, so something like a giraffe or a wildebeest or a calf, something that when it's born it has the ability, if it wanted to walk off. Well, it's really important to be born with an instinctual mechanism that makes you want to maintain a proximity, because it keeps you alive, it's for survival. Social releases, they are the things that infants do that elicit caregiving, so that make us want to look after them, so laughing, crying, those kind of things. Then you come on to stages of attachment. That was identified by Schaefer, and the 4 stages, you've got pre-attachment, which is where you prefer humans to objects. Indiscriminate, which is where you don't discriminate, you have to be held by anybody. The discriminate stage is where you have a specific preference for a particular person, a particular attachment. And then finally, multiple attachment is where you develop several attachments with many different adults, aunties, uncles, etc. Multiple attachments as a thing is Rutter, who said that you can form multiple attachments and they're of equal importance. Unlike Bowlby's idea of monetary, for instance, where you have one singular attachment. The Glaswegian infant study done by Schaefer and Emerson, that was trying to see whether or not they do have multiple attachments, and they found that by 18 months most people did have multiple attachments, and that 31% had at least 5 attachments or more after 18 months. So it's strengthening the case for multiple attachments being a feature rather than, again, Bowlby's monotropy. Role of the father, traditionally seen as a playmate and not something which can offer any level of security. There's conflicting evidence about that, but there is much more of a notion now that the role the father plays is one of caring, loving, nurturing, etc., not just there as a playmate. Animal attachments or animal studies of attachment, sorry. So the most famous ones is Harlow and Lorenz. So Lorenz is the goslings, so we got goslings to imprint upon him, imprinting being the mechanism the animal kingdom uses for attachment. And that's obviously the next one that's on there is imprinting. So imprinting can be done by things like smell or sight. If you remember what farmers do sometimes with the orphaned lambs is they'll remove the fleece and they'll put, or a lamb who's been orphaned, they'll have the fleece of a dead lamb wrapped around it and put with a mother lamb who's lost their infant, okay? And it shows that there isn't anything as complex as human connections, human emotions, it's simply based on something like smell. Next thing you come to is Harlow, and Harlow did loads of different studies, but Harlow is pretty much showing you that contact comfort is much more important than food as a driver for attachment. And some of the more famous ones is where he would scare the monkey and he would see whether or not the monkey would run off or where they would run off to, and they always ran off to the cloth mother. If you also remember that variation in Harlow's monkeys where they put them in a new environment, in a new room, and if they had the wire mother there, they wouldn't go off and explore, but if the cloth mother was there, they would go off and explore. So it shows that there was a secure base there for them, and it does show that comfort was more of a driver for attachment. Learning theory is one of the explanations of attachment. So learning theory is split into both operant conditioning and classical conditioning. Classical conditioning being you learn to make an association, and operant conditioning can be positive and negative reinforcements. Well, if you don't like being hungry and that causes you distress, if the mother feeds you, that takes away the hunger, so that's negatively reinforced. It takes away something bad, so you keep doing the behaviour. So a lot of learning theory was all to do with, initially you form attachments based on the people who feed you. And that feeds into the next idea of cupboard love. So cupboard love was the initial idea that you form an attachment to the person who feeds you. Obviously Harlow's research and loads of research now refutes the idea that you don't just form attachments to the people who feed you. Then moving on to Bowlby's monotropic theory. So Bowlby assumes that you have one singular attachment, usually to the mother, that's stronger and more important than any others. And that obviously flies in the face of Schaefer and Emerson's multiple attachments idea. The critical period, Bowlby also suggests that there's this time where you have to form an attachment, otherwise there'll be negative outcomes later in life. And the critical period is said to be between about 6 months old and 2 years. But as you will have seen with things like the Romanian orphan studies, again there's a little bit of a dispute there about whether or not that critical period is important. Also the idea of Genie and the the Czech twins, they also show that maybe a critical period isn't as important as Bowlby identified. Okay, the internal working model, that is the idea that your first attachment is the one that sets up all the attachments for later on in life. Ainsworth's strange situation. This is something Mary Ainsworth created where there was a series of different stages where you'd put an infant in the room and then their attachment figure would go and a stranger would come in, then they'd be left on their own, then mother would return, and there's 8 of these different stages. And what we're looking for is what does the child do? Because from the strange situation, all of the next ones that are on here, we can see is there a secure base. So a secure base is a person who the infant is happy to have in the room and will go off and explore and will continue to come back to that secure base. But what Ainsworth's strange situation also found was these 3 different types of attachment. So secure attachment, avoidant or insecure avoidant, and insecure resistant. Now the secure attachment is where they have a little bit of stranger anxiety, but as long as the attachment figure is there, they'll go off and explore, okay? They do want their attachment figure back, okay? So they will protest when mum leaves, and they'll find it a little bit difficult to be comforted by a stranger. The insecure avoidant, they treat strangers the same as their attachment figure, so it shows that there isn't that much of an attachment there, but they also won't try and seek out their attachment figure. Okay, so when they leave, they're not too bothered. When they come back, they're not too bothered. The insecure resistant is where they'll both seek and reject attention. So if their attachment figure leaves, they'll be really upset and they'll be protesting. And then when they come back, they'll want to be picked up, and as soon as they get picked up, they'll want to be put back down. So it's that kind of resistant attachment style. And then from Ainsworth's strange situation with all that, you then get onto cultural variations of attachment. And cultural variations of attachment was the work done by the likes of Van Azendoorn, etc. And one of the main findings that they found there is, yes, Ainsworth's 3 attachment styles were seen across cultures. Okay, so the most dominant was always secure. And what was happening there is they did a meta-analysis of 30-odd studies in 8 different countries. And they found Germany had more of an avoidance style, but secure was still the strongest in all different categories. What they did find though is that, and this is an important phrase to be able to get right, there was more intra-cultural differences than inter-cultural differences. Now, intra-cultural differences mean there were more differences within one country than there were across countries. So let's say in America they did 10 studies, for instance. There was more difference between all 10 studies in America than there was between studies with China, Spain, and across or inter-cultures. That's what that means. You've also got the idea of ethnocentrism, or something being ethnocentric, and that is to assume that your culture and your way of doing things is superior to anybody else's. So you talk about the strange situation maybe being ethnocentric when you talk about Germany, for instance. So they say that Germany has got more avoidance, and it's almost like saying that that's a bad thing, a negative thing. And yet within the German culture, they try to promote independence. So of course they'd be more avoidant by that classification. So being ethnocentric is you putting your own culture onto somebody else and assuming that yours is better, or yours is the standard everyone should be judged by. Then we go on to Bowlby's maternal deprivation hypothesis, and he created that using studies like the 44 Thieves. So having a look at juvenile delinquents who had been put into a youth offenders prison and tried to look at predictable things that might have happened to them. And what they found is, or what he found, is that they were more likely to have intellectual retardation, affectionate psychopathy, and to be delinquent, so not following the rules, etc. It is worth bearing in mind that Bowlby himself coined the term affectionate psychopathy, and actually not a lot of other psychologists have ever picked it up. There is also a bit of an accusation that maybe he did that after he'd done his research, so he named a behaviour rather than planning to try and find a behaviour, which isn't the best way of saying, doing scientific inquiry. Okay, on to the last page then. So benefits of early adoption. What you will have done, or hopefully will have done, is in your reading saw that if you can adopt a child before 6 months, the outcome seems to be an awful lot better than adopting a child after 6 months. Okay, and the older the child is at adoption, then the more negative effects might be present. So the earlier you can adopt, the research suggests the better, basically. Short-term deprivation, that is looking at the idea of, is there a predictable sequence of what happens? And with short-term deprivation you get protest, despair and detachment, so that predictable 3 behaviours. Then on to Quinton and Rutter. Now Quinton and Rutter broadly found support for the notion that if you suffer separation from your attachment figure when you're younger, it has negative effects. And what they found there is kids under 5 years old who had been separated from their attachment figure had more behavioural problems. Okay, so there is that level of support to say if you suffered separation when you were younger, that there may be more behavioural issues when you're older. Privation, never having had an attachment. Okay, as opposed to deprivation, which is where you've had one, that's then taken away like we were just talking about. Jeannie is one of the most probably famous studies of privation, where she was locked away in a bedroom and she was strapped to a high chair or potty chair until the age of about 13 she was when she was found. Sometimes they would move her from the high chair into a cot with like a metal grid, keeping them in place, but severe case of neglect. Jeannie's an interesting case study because you can see what the effects of years of privation can do to a person. And there's an argument to say that maybe she did learn language, but she didn't learn the wide spectrum of language that we typically use. Maybe she couldn't form an attachment, but again, there's some arguments to say that the people who worked closest with her would say that there was an attachment there formed. But it is certainly suggesting that an attachment when you're younger is really important. Remember, Jeannie was 13 when she was found, so that goes back to that benefits of early adoption. The earlier you can kind of get someone out of a certain situation, maybe the better. The Czech twins is another study, sometimes called the Kolachova twins. This is two young boys who were neglected, but they recovered from their effects of privation. They went on to have relationships and attachments and so on. The argument there is that that kind of goes against Jeannie and says, well, Jeannie wasn't able to, but these boys who suffered it were, but they were together. So there's potentially interaction there between the two of them, so that could be the main reason. Then on to the Romanian orphan studies. So again, it was Michael Rutter who did an awful lot of work with the Romanian orphan studies. But in the 90s, there was a big crisis out in Romania, and a lot of infants came to Britain and they were looked after by British families. And again, this goes hand in hand with the effects of institutionalisation. Those people who had been in there for a very long period of time had more negative outcomes. So things like difficult peer relationships, their IQ and their intellectual levels were a lot lower. I think even some of the Romanian orphan studies looked at things like their head size to see if that had made an impact, and there wasn't much of one. One of the main findings of the Romanian orphan studies is about intelligence. So when they looked at people who'd been adopted earlier, they, by the time they got to the age of GCSEs, had a similar GCSE kind of level equivalent as their adopted counterparts. Whereas the older they were, so if they were like 2 years old by the time they'd come to the UK to be adopted, the effects of institutionalisation had really taken hold there, and so their IQ was less, they weren't good with friendship groups and so on. Then on to influence of early attachment on childhood relationships. So secure infants are more confident, they're more curious, they're more resilient, and they're better able to form close friendships with their peers. So that idea of a continuity hypothesis, your attachment when you were younger, it affects the way you are when you're older, and that whatever your attachment was when you were younger is what your attachment is going to be with peers and so on. So if you had a secure attachment, you were said to be more curious, confident, etc. In terms of the influence of early attachment on adult relationships, there's conflicting evidence to suggest what happens there. There is evidence that shows a continuity. So if you were securely attached as a child, you are a securely attached adult in your adult relationships, but also you are securely attached in your relationships with your own children. There's conflicting evidence that basically says, and it's to kind of get away from that pessimistic idea that if you had a poor attachment when you were younger, that you would also have the same attachment with your children. And there's loads of evidence that suggests that isn't the case. And then finally onto the love quiz, the Hazen and Shaver love quiz. That shows broadly that Ainsworth's attachment styles do continue as adults with their own kids. Okay, so the love quiz is a way of assessing attachment styles. There's also the adult attachment interview that you might want to have a look at. It's not something that was put in this, but as a little bit of extra reading, the adult attachment interview by Main, and see whether or not you think that demonstrates the continuity hypothesis. Okay, so obviously you've gone through all of those. You should now be able to either fill in the ones that you didn't know and tick the ones that you got right, total it up and see what your percentage is. Okay, so I will talk to you again soon. Goodbye.